All right, well, welcome back for another media briefing, this time focused on restarting global travel. I'm very pleased to be here with Conrad Clifford, who's our Deputy Director General, as well as with Alan Murray Hayden, the Head of Airline, Airport and Security Products, I should say, but more importantly, really the driving force behind the IATA Travel Pass. So what we'd like to do is to have a short presentation by Conrad and Alan, and then we'll throw it open to questions. And those questions are open as well to those people who are participating online. So for those who are listening in, don't hesitate to type questions into the chat function. So Conrad, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tony. And thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to spend some time with you. You'll have seen the press release that we put out earlier today on reopening borders. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk through some of the things that we're seeing and doing, and then I'll hand over to Alan to talk about the IATA Travel Pass. So the state of recovery in international markets is still very weak, and this is an important point to notice that domestic recovery has been quite good, but international recovery is still very poor indeed. And what we see here is that domestic travel will rebound to 73% of 2019 levels this year, but international traffic will only rebound to 22% of pre-COVID levels this year. So what it means is pretty good domestic recovery globally, but international is still in a deep crisis. The lack of harmonized border measures, restrictions and procedures is a major cause of the failure in any restart to international travel. The IATA passenger survey confirms the confusion over measures as a disincentive to travel. 79% of respondents thought that the rules and the accompanying paperwork were a challenge to understand. 67% saw arranging testing as a hassle, and 89% agreed that governments must standardize vaccination testing and vaccination certification. And we'll show you the data in a minute, and it's no wonder when you look at the data. We analyzed the entry restrictions of the top 50 air travel markets, and we saw that 7 states have no restrictions, 5 have no entry restrictions, but you might still have to quarantine. 38 states have restrictions of a bewildering variety, and I'll just give you a few examples. Out of 38 states where restrictions are still in place, 24 differentiate on some form of country risk categorization, but there is little consistency in the risk categorization. And what this means in practice is that one country could be on another country's green list, or it could be on another country's amber list, or it could be on another country's red list because of this inconsistency. And 20 states foresee exemptions for some or all vaccinated packs, and these are pretty broad exemptions, particularly if you talk about Europe or North America. But some have very limited exemptions. So in Thailand, we have the sandboxes, which are only valid for the islands of Phuket and Koh Samui. In Philippines, passengers have to be vaccinated in the Philippines to count for exemptions, and that rules out all the foreigners. In Singapore, we have the vaccinated travel lanes, but again, those are restricted at the moment to Germany and Brunei. So out of the 20 states that foresee exemptions for some or all vaccinated packs, only 6, and it could be 8, and we're waiting for further clarification from the US and the UK, but only 6 will allow entry to unvaccinated minors accompanied by vaccinated adults. And finally, if you're not confused, I mean, I get confused looking at this, but the 9 states do not recognize the full WHO list of vaccines. So this is a further source of inconsistency and confusion for travelers. So that's on the vaccination side. And on the testing side, it's similarly very confusing. Again, 50 of the largest markets, and out of 46 states that require pre-departure testing for all or some passengers, 24 only accept PCR tests. 16 allow rapid antigen tests, But out of these 16, there are 3 that accept antigen tests as a general rule, but will still require PCR tests from a certain group of passengers, like those arriving from high-risk countries. The 6 remaining states do not allow antigen, but do allow a broader range of diagnostic tests in addition to PCR. And additionally, 33 states exempt minors from testing, but with no consistency on age, and 20 states provide exemptions from testing for recovered COVID-19 travelers, but with different conditions, including, for example, how to actually prove prior infection. So it's extremely confusing. It's clear that the rules are a total mess, and this isn't only making it difficult for passengers to fly, it's putting people off flying. It's also impacting their experience at the airport. The plethora of rules is adding to processing times through airports, putting strain on staff and infrastructure. And IATA research from the first half of 2021 demonstrated that pre-COVID-19, passengers spent about 1.5 hours in travel processes on the ground for every journey. That was both on departure and on arrival at the other end. But that ballooned to 3 hours during peak time with travel volumes in the first half of this year. And don't forget, travel volumes in the first half of this year were only at something like 30% of pre-COVID levels. So basically, we saw processing time double with still 30% levels of traffic. The greatest increases are at check-in and border control, where travel health credentials are being checked, and it's mainly coming because of the use of paper documentation. But what's really worrying is that our modelling suggests that without process improvement, the time spent in airport processes could reach 5.5 hours per trip. So I mentioned at the beginning 1.5 hours pre-COVID, but it could rise as high as 5.5 hours if we get traffic levels back to 75% of pre-COVID. And if we get traffic levels back to where we were pre-COVID, it could be as high as 8 hours per trip. This research and these conclusions are also backed up by recent Eurocontrol data, which revealed that during the pandemic, departure delays due to immigration, customs and health have jumped from almost nothing to account for nearly 10 to 20% of all primary delay. If these issues aren't resolved, then airport delays will become intolerable as we start to see traffic recover, and the travel process will become log-jammed. The situation can't continue. Governments claim to be following the science, but the science can't possibly justify such a wide variety of models and restrictions and rules. Our position is very clear. Governments should follow a risk-based model that permits the opening of borders and restoration of connectivity by allowing vaccinated passengers to travel without restriction. And for those unable to be vaccinated, a simple pre-departure negative antigen test should be sufficient. And it's only by aligning procedures that we can hope to return to pre-COVID traffic levels with the sort of efficiency and the convenience and the comfort that everybody wants. And so digital solutions are an essential part of that journey. Digital COVID-19 vaccine certificates are one of the core foundations to enable the restart of international travel. For example, the EU Digital COVID Certificate, or DCC, this was developed in record time. It's been implemented in 27 states in the EU. It has a system of mutual recognition with other similar digital certificates in place. In the current absence of a single global standard for digital vaccine certificates, this DCC should serve as a blueprint to other nations looking to implement digital vaccination certification and to help facilitate travel and its associated economic benefits. The EU DCC meets several key criteria which have been identified as important if a digital vaccination certificate is to be effective. It includes the flexibility to be used in both paper and digital format, and that's essential. And it includes the use of a QR code. And the gateway that the EU has built to authenticate information is also highly flexible. But I've spoken about digital certificates. These are not the only digital tools to help facilitate restart. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Alan Murray Hayden, and he has led the development and the rollout of the IATA Travel Pass, which is a key digital tool to enable passengers and governments to travel and reopen borders successfully. And Alan is going to update us now on the latest developments in the program. Thank you, Alan. Over to you.
Thank you, Conrad. Oh, thank you. Okay, I think as Conrad has demonstrated, there's two key issues which are facing us at the moment. The first one is confusion in terms of the regulations. So passengers, they just don't quite know what they need to do. I think we've all suffered from that when they're traveling. We're just not quite sure what's needed. And the second thing is chaos, because when passengers get to the airport, I think we've all seen these pictures, and probably some of us have experienced them. And quite frankly, passengers are not going to resume traveling unless they absolutely have to, while you still have this confusion and chaos at the airports. I mean, which of us wants to travel, to see family and then be faced with 4, 5, 6 hour waits at the airports? None of us. So we're not going to travel unless we can sort this out. Effectively, the fun has been taken out of travel, and what we've got to do is get back to a position where traveling is pleasurable, and we can get back to traveling and meeting families. And that's really why we developed the IATA Travel Pass. What we're trying to do is put together a system where passengers can prove their identity. They can then check what the regulations are for their destination and any transit points. They can be told what they need to, do. They can be told where they need to get tested. They can then check whether they meet all the regulations, and then they can share with airlines, airports, and governments before they get to the airport. And that's really the most important thing. You want to make sure that passengers can share this with the... you want to make sure that passengers can share these details with the various parties before they get to the airport, and they don't need to wait. The IATA, before I get into some of the functionality, it's been developed based on 4 key elements. The first thing is what we call a digital passport. And that's a very simple thing. Effectively, it's just a digital version of our passports, no more, no less. And it's based on the ICAO DTC standard. So that's the first thing the passenger does in the solution. The second thing they can do is they import their itinerary, and at that point they get presented with what the regulations are for their destination. This is based on something called thematic, and most of you probably won't have heard of thematic, but I can guarantee you've all used it multiple times, because every time you check in for a flight, your nationality and your itinerary are passed through thematic, and we've got all of the immigration regulations in there, and then we say yes or no, you meet the regulations, you don't, and if you do, check-in proceeds seamlessly. To give you an idea, before COVID came along, we used to update that database about 50 to 55 times per day, and now we're up 200 updates per day. So that'll give you an idea of the dynamic nature of the COVID regulations. So the whole solution is based on that thematic solution. The third thing is testing and vaccinations. So I think we've all seen the wonderful work which has been done on vaccinations. So we've enabled passengers to scan them and then import the details. And then finally, passengers can share these details directly from their phone to the destination, to the airlines, airports, and governments, using what we call verifiable credentials and decentralized technologies. What that means is that the data resides in the passenger's phone, and they share it with the parties. So there is no central database. It's not going through. IATA has no access to any passenger's data. And only when they choose to share it with those parties, that's when the data gets shared. What that means is, obviously, if we don't have access to that data, we then can't store it, which means that we put passengers in complete control of their own data. And that's the way the industry needs to go. Okay, if we get into how the solution works, there's basically about 5 or 6 different steps. The first thing is the passenger creates a digital version of their passport, as I mentioned a minute ago. The next thing they do is they put their PNR number in there, and then they import their itinerary. And as soon as they import their itinerary, we then present to them exactly what the regulations are for their destination and transit point. And we also tell them if they need to get tested, where they can get tested in their locality for the exact type of test they need. So at that point, if they need testing, they can go get tested and receive the results on their phone as a verifiable credential. Then if they've got a vaccine certificate, they can then scan it. You've probably all seen the DCC or all the different vaccination certificates out there. So they can scan their vaccine certificate. So at that point, they will have the test results and their proof of vaccination on their phone. We then do another check and we say, do these meet the immigration regulations? And if they do, we issue them what we call an OK to travel. And the passenger can then go through the airport by purely either showing that OK to travel, showing the screen, we just got OK to travel, or even better, they can share it with the airline, airport, and government before they arrive at the airport. And if they can do that, that means that we get back to the pre-COVID situation where passengers don't need to queue up for hours at the airport. Okay, to give you an idea, we went live with version 2 of the application last week. And at the moment, we cover vaccine certificates for 52 countries in the world, representing 54% of all international traffic. But we're working on expanding that, and by the end of November, we will cover vaccine certificates from 74 countries, which will represent 85% of global traffic. So this really is an international, worldwide solution. If we look at these are where we've been trialing it. So up to now, we've trialed it with 76 different airlines across 286 countries in the world. The purpose of these trials were really to prove the technology, but also prove that we can capture all of the immigration regulations for every country and just make sure that it worked for every country and every region in the world and also for every nationality. And we're at that point now. And so what's going to be happening over the coming weeks is that many international airlines are going to be rolling this out. So if we look at the specific, we are very pleased to announce that at the AGM we've reached agreement with with many of these airlines. So Qatar, Etihad, Jazeera, Royal Jordanian, and Emirates, who you probably know signed up to the solution a couple of weeks ago and is currently rolling it out across its network. You'll also see a lot more announcements over the coming weeks as more and more airlines come on board with this, come on board using the IATA Travel Pass. Okay, with that, I'd like to hand over to Tony.
Great, thank you very much. It was a great summary on both the issue, the problem, and one of the potential solutions. Any questions? Yes.
Thanks very much. My name is Adam Crichton from The Australian. Sorry to ask a parochial question, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the Australian kind of border situation, where it's been shut longer than any other border in the world, and there's been a recent announcement in some weeks that sometime in November the border might reopen, but only to Australian citizens, and even then you're going to have to quarantine at both ends. So I just wanted your general thoughts on whether that approach is sensible and sound and rational, in your view.
Yeah, so we welcome any decision by any government to reopen its borders, and many countries prefer to take this in baby steps, if you like. So I think what the Australian government is trying to do is to open up their border to Australian citizens first, and particularly with the year end and Christmas coming. And I hope that as they become more confident in that they'll extend it out to a wider group of passengers and travellers. That's really what we hope for.
Yep.
I'll ask what Tony and I discussed a little while ago. The IATA has been calling for some time now for more consistent standards across countries, and I see that chart of how different it is. So what can IATA do, and even outside IATA, how does that change to where there's more synchronization among nations? Why will it change?
Yeah.
So we have something called the High-Level COVID Conference coming up, being driven by ICAO later on this month. And this is drawing together at a ministerial level from all of the ICAO 190 countries to come up with some form of declaration. And we're hoping that within that declaration they will also highlight the need for standardization and harmonization. And if they do, that will definitely provide impetus for associations like ourselves to go and talk to governments about how to better harmonize. So We need the governments to confirm they want to do this first, and then we can start to advocate with how to sort of close the gaps between countries.
Yeah. And also, Conrad, I suppose if we see something good happening in one part of the world,
Yes, best practice.
we talk to governments in other parts of the world
Yeah.
and say, have a look at.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I know you've been on the front line in some of those discussions.
Yeah, yeah. So whenever we see a government doing something that makes a lot of sense, we try to promote that to other governments. And that can be very useful because a lot of this is about experience. Countries have differing degrees of risk. So if you've got a country that has a lower appetite for risk, if it can see another country that has done something successfully, then they will hopefully follow that. And that's another approach that we use.
Yeah, we'll take a question. Sure, we'll go there, and then we'll take a question in the gallery as well. So you go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. You actually just answered part of the question I was going to ask about governments. I'm Heather from the New York Times. But I guess my question, are you having any success with any government in getting interest? You know, I know you haven't firmed anything up, but for this pass, and has this been discussed at all as a solution for the United States when the United States begins to allow people in from abroad and needs a more consistent way of checking vaccination records? Are there any conversations about using this pass for that purpose?
That's probably one for Alan, I think.
Yeah, we've had conversations with a number of different governments, and there's some governments have officially endorsed it. So if you look at Singapore as a good example, we have a country which endorses it. But in reality, in practice, what's not so important is whether a country endorses it; it's whether they accept it. So if you look at this situation in the United States, they basically said they will accept electronic proof of vaccination and proof of testing. So the U.S. government will. The IATA travel pass meets the requirements of the US government, and nearly every government in the world will accept it. What we would ultimately like to see is getting to a position where we can actually, where the governments will work with us in terms of enabling passengers to share the data. Because if you can imagine from a government perspective, if they can receive all of the passengers, both passport and vaccination and test certificates in advance of the passenger leaving, then you can actually make sure that people don't arrive at your border who don't meet your requirements. So we will be very hopeful of working closely with governments to actually roll that element of the solution out over the coming months. So yeah, that's kind of hopefully will come a little bit further down the road. But we've also got to remember the IATA Travel Pass is primarily there for airlines. What we're trying to do is stop the roll this out and stop the problems actually at the departure airport and obviously the destination as well. So in some ways, departure airport is more on the airline side and arrival is at the government side. So we'll focus in on airlines at the moment, but as I said, hopefully governments will come on board very soon as well.
Yeah. And I suppose in a lot of cases, what we're also seeing is the governments are trusting that the airlines have boarded people who come with the right documentation and not necessarily doing the checks on arrival.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all seen that this week. All the checks are being done by airlines. You know, it's their government regulations, but all of the checks are being done by airlines. So if the airlines can do this more, if airlines can automate the process, have it all done off airport, it really will be beneficial, both also at the destination point.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Michal from Israel Financial Newspaper. I would like to ask about, does IATA encourage governments to operate in bilateral or mutual restrictions? I mean, nowadays you see countries that not allow other citizens to enter their country. For example, the US, Europe, as today. Do you do anything, to encourage government to work similar for both entry and of both countries? And another question, you mentioned governments that did operate in a way that you encourage and you want other governments to see that. Can you give some examples?
The first part, I think, Conrad?
So in terms of working with government, yes, we do. How this works in practice is that normally a government will identify a country that it feels comfortable to open its borders to. And then usually there'll be talks between generally the health officials and Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials between those two countries. and then the airlines will get involved, and then we'll get involved. That's the sort of the way the process generally works. So it really starts with intergovernmental comfort about opening their borders to another particular country. And at the moment, it's bilateral. It's always between two countries. There might be an opportunity for bilateral later on. Of course, if you're talking about the EU, you can probably get to more countries, but it tends to be more bilateral at the moment.
I just wanted to check with you. You mentioned about 50 countries, the largest 50 markets being surveyed. Is it possible to figure out which these are? And the second part is, have you taken into consideration inter-country travel, which also impose restrictions in your survey?
So you mean domestic travel? Yeah. At the moment, not. It can still be used for domestic travel because on the phone you're going to have your proof of vaccination and you also have your test results. But we don't have the regulations within a country, within the solution at the moment. So it's primarily for international travel at the moment. Or rather, you're going to get the most benefits out of international travel, but it still could be used on a domestic routes.
Yeah, but I think maybe we reflect back on what our Director General said this morning. If this is about preventing risk, there's no point in having, vaccination requirements or testing requirements for domestic travel. So we're hoping that will not go beyond the international travel markets. In the front row.
Hi, my name is David Slotnick. I'm with the Points Guy. It seems like documentation is one issue, but the bigger issue that we've been seeing, I think, is that people are confused seeing differing restrictions between different countries, even within an entity like the EU. Is IATA working on standardizing those developments at all, or lobbying for that kind of standardization just across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly what I was talking about, what I meant actually when I was talking about ICAO. We're definitely looking for governments to agree to harmonization, and then we will work with them to try and close the gaps between the different standards across all of the countries, because it's extremely confusing for travelers. And I'm sure all of you that have traveled, it's very, very difficult to know what you're supposed to be doing. And also it seems to be changing very often. So again, you just have to, if you're traveling anywhere, when I came here, I had to keep checking websites again and again and again to make sure that I was still in line with whatever the health requirements were. And that's really putting passengers off traveling. And it causes a lot of stress and worry. And we want to take that away. So that's really something that we want governments to buy into, and then we'll work with them to try and sort it out.
Yeah, and I suppose it's degrees of improvement. So
yeah,
it's better to have your borders open with complexity than closed. But once the borders are open, you prefer that they open without complexity.
exactly.
But if it's a choice between complex opening or not opening, you'll take the opening and then
Yeah.
you work on the complexity.
Yeah.
So this is a big puzzle that we need to solve, and it's going to take work at all levels of interaction between states and industry to try and work it out, I would say.
Yeah, and the other thing we see is that when countries initially open borders, they typically apply much stricter regulation, and then they gradually relax it. But we need that gradual relaxation to eventually result in a removal. We don't want to see a whole series of regulation and restrictions to be enacted, and then later on they don't actually need to be there, but they're still there because they haven't been taken away. So that's another thing that we're very concerned about.
We have a question from a listener online, all the way in Australia. And the question is, have airlines contributed to the problem of complexity by adopting different types of travel passes and solutions that they're trying to sell to their customers to manage this data?
I don't think so. I think it comes down to the design of the individual travel passes. Again, we're doing the IATA travel pass, but there are other solutions out there. What I think we would say to the industry is just use one of them, like preferably, obviously, the IATA travel pass, as we developed it, but use one of the different solutions out there. A second thing which I'd like to emphasize is we don't necessarily want the IATA travel pass to be around here for much longer. It's a short-term solution. What we want to do is have the IATA travel pass embedded within airlines' own mobile applications. You know, I think I'll give you a good example. Like I travel frequently between Geneva and Amsterdam. I buy my ticket on my on the airline's mobile app. I check in, I select my seat. I do everything on the airline's apps, and I want to do all of this on their apps as well. So the idea that we would have separate apps out there, I don't think that that's the long-term solution. It needs to be embedded within the airline's own check-in systems.
Right. Are there any other questions? I suppose just one clarification from my side. So in terms of the stage at which the IATA Travel Pass is, we've had a significant amount of testing. Now it's moving into the operational phase.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for the passenger? They need to be traveling on a specific airline that uses this, on a specific route. Can you walk us through maybe what the passenger experience would look like?
Okay, that's a very good question. Yeah, effectively an airline needs to come on board, so it's all driven on an airline by airline basis. If you go, for example, onto it at the moment and you select Emirates, you can then select your Emirates flight. So all that the basis of the application is actually knowing the itinerary of the passenger. And the reason behind that is because you need to tell them what the regulations are for their itinerary. And then we need to be able to check whether they meet those regulations. So it really comes down to an airline basis.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. And then, Conrad, maybe just one question to you, but if we're looking at the approach to trying to get borders open, so one level of that is the ICAO level.
Yeah.
Is that going to be fast enough? And are there other areas that we're also trying to push to try and get borders reopened?
Yeah, probably the ICAO will not be so fast. So what we're also looking at is individual countries where we can work with them to actually open borders, or it's actually pairs of countries. So there are countries we know that want to open their borders to one another, and we would like to be involved in that process and to facilitate that process on behalf of our member airlines.
And the reception to this, at one point we were asking countries to have reopening plans.
Yeah.
What's the reception to that been like?
Yeah, so it's been mixed. So when we've approached governments and said, do you have a roadmap to open, some governments have said no, some governments have said yes. And then if they've said yes and we've said, could we be involved with you on that opening, particularly on bridging that gap between policy and actual implementation, some governments have viewed that very positively and others not. So again, it goes back to working with those governments that are willing and have the appetite to open their borders, and then trying to develop best practice that we can then use with other governments to reassure them to also open their borders.
Okay. I don't see any other questions in the room. There is a question online, which I don't quite understand. It's asking about digital identification. And I think it's quite specific to the US, saying that Apple is developing a digital ID that can in some ways replace a driver's license. And I think the gist of the question here is not so much specific to the US, because I don't think we can comment on the domestic market here, but more, are we concerned about the fact that we may have several ways of identification, digital identification, and how does that impact on an industry restart? Do we need to have one, or can we have many? For the personal identification, and I suppose it's the same for the COVID certifications. So, Alan, any comments there?
I think we could have many. I think Apple, it's the first I've heard of it, but I think it's a natural extension of Apple and probably Android. We have our ICAO standard for the creation of digital passports. So I would have expected that Apple and Samsung would adopt that standard and then enable passengers to have digital versions of their passport on their phone. I think it's a natural extension. Apple has also announced that they're allowing people to import vaccine certificates, so I can also imagine that's going to happen. I think we would broadly welcome this. Anything which will make it easier for the passenger to receive to share their vaccination, their test results, and their documents with airlines, airports, and governments has got to be welcomed.
Okay. And then, absolute last question, unless there's someone else in the audience,
Yeah.
is anything from IATA Travel Pass going to stay in the industry after we've solved COVID?
Yeah, completely. The IATA Travel Pass was actually under development before COVID came along, and it's all based around the One ID contactless travel concept. So once COVID is gone, hopefully we'll be left with that whole concept of digital identities on your phone. So if you could think, the end goal in this is that passengers will be able to share their passport details and their selfie with airlines, airports, and governments before they leave home. And then when they get to the airport, all the different parties who the passenger has chosen to share their data with will have done all the pre-screening of them. So if you can imagine in the future, you will arrive for your flight, you'll arrive at the airport, you'll go to the self-bag drop, you'll basically look at a camera and they'll go, this is Alan Murray Hayden, he's flying to Boston. It'll spit out a bag tag, you put it on the bag system. You then go to security. Again, you look up at a camera and they go, this is Alan Murray Hayden, he's flying today. They allow them through. The same with immigration. If you can imagine, immigration has the data. They see your face, gates open and you walk through. Self-boarding gates, admission to frequent flyer lounge. So anytime you need to physically show your documents, we now have the ability in the IATA Travel Pass to automate that. So you, in theory, and we were working on this before COVID hit, but we were working on a project where you could walk from London to Sydney, and every single touch point you would clear based on your face. And that comes back to what we started out the presentation with. It's bringing the joy and fun back into traveling. Can you imagine how great that would be, not having to take all your liquids and gels out, being able to just walk from curbside onto the plane and then off the plane at the other end? And that's what the IATA Travel Pass enables right now today. And we'll start bringing partners on board over the coming months. And you'll start to see the proliferation of this type of system.
And I suppose that's the difference between IATA Travel Pass and some of the other passes that are on the market. They don't integrate so much with the airline system in that same way.
Yeah, correct. And also, I think governments, we've obviously been talking with governments about this, and governments really see the benefit of this. A lot of the time governments can be criticized because they're slow to come to the table. With this, governments are saying, you know what, this is brilliant for our passengers. This will also solve some of the problems with border control. So governments are really on board with this. I think airports also, airports are looking at it and thinking, we can get more people through our airport and provide a better experience. And of course, airlines love it because it gets rid of all these touch points which nobody really wants to do. So I think you're going to see this type of technology really taking off in the next couple of years.
Super. So something good that might come out of COVID.
Absolutely.
Super. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your attention here. You hear the bells ringing upstairs, so the CEO forum is about to start. Have a good rest of the day, and we'll also see you hopefully at the Boeing reception this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.